Dear colleagues, many thanks for the kind introduction, Mr. Spearman. As you may know, the invitation to talk to you took me by surprise because I take the place for Marianne Leutzinger-Bohleber, who greets you very heartily and who regrets that she couldn't come here. But the surprise did not affect my feeling of gratitude and of being honored that you are interested in my thoughts on time and violence. So, as you have heard, I come from Munich, Bavaria. Even there in the idyllic south, violence is a present topic, as you can see from these pictures. You see the picture of two young men who hit a 50-year-old peaceful family father to death in a Munich metro only a few weeks ago. He had taken the moral courage and tried to persuade them to desist from threatening children in the train. They followed him to the next station, knocked him down, and kicked him to death. When I talked to my 24-year-old son about this crime, he told me about his deep personal shock when he realized that the murderers wore the same fashion style he had liked in his earlier adolescence: wide and somehow childish baggy pants and XXX hood shirts. This clothing style was connected to hip-hop subculture, characterized by the musical ritual of playful but peaceful, pseudo-violent battling. Now, the reality of violent murder had harmfully invaded the adolescent playground. Oh no, I wanted to skip that. So, what are the factors of violence? If we just have a look at the brain, which is not really my field, and you have heard very qualified speeches about this, aggressive behavior is based on a double mechanism. You have the impulses and you have the inhibition of impulses. Obviously, there are specific areas responsible for the inhibition of aggression. The most famous clinical example for this basic insight is Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, in 1848, an iron rod spared Phineas Gage's skull in an accident. It was a miracle that he survived, but it was not by surviving that he gained his place in the annals of neuroscience. It was his personality change following the incident. Phineas Gage suddenly changed into a feisty, aggressive type. The cortical area in his forebrain responsible for aggression inhibition did not work proper anymore, and his aggressive impulses were set free. In these times, where correlations between neuronal structure and behavior could be inferred only from the pathologist's report post-mortem, Phineas Gage was a rare opportunity to study neuropathology in the living brain. Meanwhile, neuroimaging has facilitated these studies. And although we can study the brain nearly online, I say nearly because you have the problem of the time windows, nearly online while displaying affects, the riddle of aggression has not yet been resolved. No simple localization of aggression or aggression control has been found. But most astonishingly, the results show that it might go the other way around. Life experiences like suffering from aggression, abuse, or mistreatment might change the tissue of the brain. For example, the results of Teicher and van der Kolk. Neuroplasticity is today one of the challenges of neuroscience. It poses questions that lead to fruitful cooperation with social sciences, also even with psychoanalysis, if you, for example, turn to the work of Mark Solms and the Neuropsychoanalytic Working Group. But the brain is a living organ. It's not only determined by neuronal synapses and maps, the hardware, not so hard, but the relatively hardware interacts with different systems of humoral information, the neurotransmitters and the hormonal system. But even if frequently under suspect, the hormonal system alone is not the causal explanation for aggression. Testosterone, in popular discourse often seen as the aggression hormone of young men, could not be convicted as the reason for violence. I quote the book of Rendsdorf on this. A reduced activity of the gene responsible for the production of the enzyme monoamidooxidase A correlates significantly with the incidence of criminal offenses. But a closer analysis, like by Terry Moffat, showed that the genetic defect does not predict criminality alone. It only does so in a co-occurrence with critical life events, as mistreatment and disregard in childhood. So the genetic defect might just be responsible for an impaired learning ability, capacity, due to the persistence of high monoamine concentrations. Simply speaking, with a delayed oxidasis of monoamine transmitters, you have the problem that you can't react quick enough to change. This inhibits social learning processes, including bargaining. So we are about society. Oops. Yeah. What we need is a theory and creative imperial instruments that allow for the study of the interplay between organic hardware, genetic disposition, neuroplasticity, life history, and the social context. As we have heard yesterday in the speech of Professor Meyer, societies in the process of civilization tend to monopolize violence and change personal to structural violence. I skip now the many theories because this is not really my field. Cultural memory, and I think Professor Welzer will talk to you about this in a very professional and very deep view. Cultural memory influences strongly the display of violence in persons. I come now to my field at psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic theories of aggression have greatly changed since the time of Sigmund Freud. Freud himself, originally explaining aggressiveness as part and parcel of self-preservation, changed his mind in 1920 under the impression of World War I and postulated an aggressive instinct as part of the death instinct or death drive. Later on, with extended study of ego functioning, affect regulation, and the development of self and object representations, psychoanalytic developmental and clinical concepts of aggression deal with the importance of aggression in the process of individuation, while on the other hand, clinically connections have been found between aggression and anxiety and loss of representation structure. I will come to that later on. Now, infant research has shed new light on the early modeling of aggression. I will present here only a very, very small section of infant observation studies, namely the study of temporal regulation processes, and even of this only a small amount. Child analysis, as well as empiric infant observation, have elaborated the importance of time in infant development. Pioneering study was by Condon and Sander, who found that newborn children move rhythmically with the speech rhythm of their nursing people. Now, please, the film. This is not research, it's from the internet, but I think it's highly illustrative. Now, it's always nice to see it, really. This synchrony seems to help to internalize interaction and communication experience in the infant self and allows for the emergence of consciousness and authorship and so on, very important, and affects also. The often quoted mirror neurons might provide the hardware for this fundamental process of enculturation. Louis Sander, one of the authors of this very early and important pioneering study, later described the rhythms of gaze contact as a flow of quotation moments of meeting. Quote, the recurring rhythmic flow of events becomes basic to the brain's construction of expectancy, even as early as the first days of life. End of quote. Early temporal attunement processes between mother and child lead to the construction of basic semantic and motivational networks. The richness and power of temporal interaction processes have been studied in depth by Beatrice Beebe and her group. One study only as an example. Beebe, Stern, and Jeffy studied imitative mother-child interactions and found an interesting coactive pattern. They found that mothers extended their activity when the baby starts imitation, and they tend to answer as early as possible to activities if they are initiated by the baby. So in both cases, the mother actively tends to make the coactive time longer. This is a very important pattern in early interaction. So by this training, by the age of 4 months, babies expect fixed temporal playing sequences. The study by Rocha, Querido, and Triano showed they filmed toddlers of 2, 4, and 6 months of age in 1-minute organized peekaboo games under 2 different conditions. First condition, the games were sequentially ordered. So peekaboo, rise awareness, then hide, and then ha, wieder da. Second condition, the same 3 steps, but not sequentially ordered, which is a bit nonsense. First saying ha, and then hiding. So what happened? The organized game group displayed this, and the other that. So, to interpret it, the 2-month-old babies looked and smiled at both, measured was their looking and smiling reaction. The 2-month babies looked and smiled at both conditions. The elder ones reacted specifically to the organized stimulus display. So they expect. An integrated model of this temporal coordination process, and there's a huge mass of studies of this kind, has been published by Daniel Stern since the middle of the 80s. Stern's theory is centered around time molecules shaped in early interaction. He calls them protonarrative envelopes. Protonarrative envelopes are the temporal signatures of important and repeated interaction experiences. Just a conceptual example, but there are also studies in the background of this. If the baby is hungry and notices that mother is approaching, his feelings of distress, motoric agitation, and hunger will increase. So the 3 parameters you can see here, with motoric agitation being the lower line. You can experience this increase yourself when you order your food at the restaurant. The time till the waiter comes and brings what you desire is agonizing. So when mother comes, and this is at the top of the climax here, when mother comes, everything will decrease, and with satiation it will fade out. This increase in relaxation of tension is one of the basic patterns of our experience, thousands of times repeated. Stern calls it a protonarrative envelope, because many later experiences can be fitted into this dramaturgic sequence. Be it a movie, all of the movies you know are structured like this, be it a drama on stage, a novel, or your account of your Congress participation in Engelberg. You tell it home to your friends. You will bring some tension to your account, then some curiosity. You will make some complication. I met this colleague and he looked quite critical and so on. You have a climax, and then you will try to resolve it and bring it to a hopefully happy end. I was very successful, something like that. So,
I don't get it. You think this is really
Why is that so funny?
Ready?
Nintendo Wii funny? You watching golf? Is golf funny?
Is that funny?
Do it again.
Expectation. That's a, you know that? That's a V. A V game is a virtual movement measurement, and you can play golf with it. And as you see, the temporal structure is really, it's also from the internet, it's not research material, it's wonderful, because you can really see how the expectation and wish fulfillment is temporally organized. The child And what's very important is the arm of the father. The child feels secure in the situation. So it is not fear, it's laughter. What is the reaction in the end? So the study of early rhythmization and affect attunement processes led to the assumption that the better early dialogue fits the spontaneous signals of children, the better the integrative potential of children will develop. This, however, is not true. The ability is formed, living in civilization requires an internalized social and personal world, partly independent of impulses, characterized by structures and norms necessary for the selection of socially acceptable behavior sequences. This ability of self-control, so to say, is formed by conflict and aggression experience. John Doerr, even in 1983, describes the development of intentional speech acts as a second step following the preliminary phase of affect attunement. This second step is centered around the containing of negative affects. So the first step is affect matching in the sense of Daniel Stern. The baby's spontaneous affect displays and expressions are matched by analog, complementary or imitative reactions by a caregiver. These affect answers being marked. So you see, as I designed it here, it's a bit exaggerated. It's a bit bigger how mother reacts to the display of the child. And what is respecting his time, temporal curve, the time display of the affect. This is the first step, and it leads to the experience of self-coherence and of authorship. And it's also repeated very often until this training is completed. But then there is a second step, and this is negative affect matching. An example, the baby tries to mouth an object, mother prohibits it. Also very often displayed. This leads to a protest utterance accompanied by arm flapping and apparent anger. Then the mother replies with an adequately angry response. For example, "Don't you yell at your mother." And thus a circle of affect matching develops where the forbidden object is pulled to and fro, and the baby can experience the mother's reactions as a form of his own affect. The important step in this interaction pattern is the solution sequence. Initiated by the mother, she lowers the pitch of her voice, and there is a moment of intense gaze. The baby is going to learn now the form of negative affect and the forms of solution. And as we know, it will often seek to repeat this learning situation. The important difference between positive affect attunement and conflictual affect matching is that in the latter the communion is threatened and anxiety arises. This shift to intentional affect expression is driven by the need to test the state of the relationship. So only in the case of conflict, affect matching does not just serve to shape the affect expression of the child, but also to introduce something into the communication as well as into the affect regulation of the baby. In the case of conflict, the communication aims at seizing the baby's anger and nevertheless hold the borders. That is, to get him to accept that he won't get the object he longs for. You know, if it is a scissors or a candle or something, you can't have him violate himself. So, in lowering her voice and in playing the tonality of explanation, mother introduces reason and language as a third element into dialogue. It is most important that this third element has the form of language. So what the baby learns in hearing the mother's voice, verbal modulated explanation is, now that's, I am angry and she is angry, and I don't get what I want, but I do not lose her. She's still talking to me. That's the importance of the introduction of language into the early affect dialogue. As a proto-linguistic act, the early conflict matching aims at the attunement of the affect expression to a conventional form. This theory fits to a surprising empirical finding by B. Blackman and others. They studied the early vocalization rhythms and their impact on attachment quality. by measuring the fitting of spontaneous vocalizations in the mother's answering utterances in 4 months of age. The unexpected result was that 9 months later, 8 months later, with 12 months of age, the best fitting group, the green ones here in my illustration, the best fitting group showed the least secure attachment style, while the middle group developed a secure attachment. So this means that maybe it's a kind of Anpassung. Too much. Yeah. Okay. Now let me get a bit on in age, further inculturation of aggression. Social limitation of aggression is one of the main topics in psychic development. Plays and rituals accumulate action schemata in the procedural memory, serving for replacement of direct impulsive behavior by socially successful surrogate indirect behavior strategies. Every society has its methods of inculturation of impulse-inhibiting procedures. The adolescence rituals, rite de passage, in every known human society, the military hierarchy as a means of governing violence by the monopole of the state, and religion as the main strategy of delay, transferring the wish for immediate satisfaction to a better future, to a worshipped past, or to a longed-for afterworld. All of these social institutions are characterized by rituals. Now, nowadays, we are facing, as Baumann points out, the problem that all of these institutions are dissolving, and individuals have to take their relationships in another way. The military and church are not anymore so important as they were. In the ritual and rhythmic enculturation processes in early infancy, but also in adolescent socialization, the individual is brought in contact with the structures of the surrounding society and cultural memory. This memory is not only manifest in the great and enduring monuments and institutions of a society, but also in its quick reactions, its fashions, its news, and the comment on news. So I think the fashions could be, and this is a question to Professor Belzer, maybe fashions could be seen as something like the working memory of a culture. So what has all this to do? What you see here is a hip-hop battling ritual where two guys, you see the fashion? It's like the murder I showed you in the first slide, and this is shocking because these are peaceful guys. They are battling in a symbolic way, in a rhymed way. They are offending each other, but in rhymes it's very important that if they are really good, you see the audience is pleased and applauds. So this is an enculturation game of aggression. What has all this to do with violence? Peter Fonagy and Mary Target, in an influential study, described the proneness to violence, lack of identity, and mentalization. They see destructive aggression as a defense against the threat of a loss of the sense of self and the regression to the infant equivalence mode, where the difference between subjective experience and the outer world is fading away, such that own unbearable impulses are experienced as being inside the object. One important aspect of maintaining personal identity is mentalization, the ability to read the mental state of others from observable signals in interaction. Mentalization is a form of metacognition that allows to interpret human behavior as being the result of intentions. The infant acquires a theory of mind, modeling the actions of his caregivers as an expression of their inner world, their needs, wishes, purposes, fears, and so on. So the baby sees the actions of his mother, and he reconstructs these actions as intentions, gaining a picture of the intentions of the mother. And by doing so, the baby also gets ingrained to reconstruct his own intentions. So this is a very interesting double process and is necessary for the control of aggression in later life. This ability is learned best in the contact with caregivers who are themselves able to mentalize the baby's inner world and can communicate this mind model to the child. Early dialogue is a playground for the establishing of this mutual empathy. Mentalization reinforces the object constants and thus the attachment capacities of the child. The hardware for the ability to read the actions of others as expressions might be connected with the mirror neuron system, described by Rizzolato e Gallese, instantly translating observed movement into motor innervation patterns and thus laying the base of body empathy. In their 1996 paper, Fonagy and Target describe the violent patient as suffering from a deficit of metacognitive and symbolic capacities. Mr. T was depressive and showed dangerous violent behavior when he was drunk. He demonstrated this violent and aggressive interaction style frequently also in the consulting room, contemptuously depreciating the analyst, shouting, kicking chairs, running away, slamming doors. So that's quite something for an analyst. His pathology originated in a congenital spinal abnormity which had led to an intense disgust from of his mother. He had never managed to internalize a representation of a loving mother who is interested in the intentions of a child and whose intentions the baby can imagine. The imitative force of the child, of the mother mirroring his behavior, only lead to a self-representation distorted by disgust and rejection. Fonagy and Target described the psychic mechanism of the outbreak of violence like this. The act, quotation, the act of mindless aggression is characterized by an inexplicable build-up of incontainable tension and rage just before the violence. The perception of the victim as a threat and feelings of being out of control during the violent act. The act is aimed at reducing this threat and regaining intrapsychic equilibrium, end of quote. This description underlines the temporary aspect of sudden outbreak of violence. Since Mr. T was not able to successfully internalize a mentalizing object, he could not transform his experience of rejection into thoughts of any kind. His negative, disgusting self was only present as a bodily tension which rose in every situation of shame and humiliation. Then, in these moments of violence, he tried to get rid of this tension by hitting himself, things, objects, or people, the object that he had identified with the negative self. He tried to destroy this object since it was the projective container of mother's bad thoughts about him that dwelled in his muscles, metaphorically spoken. It's always in the brain, but it's not conscious and it's not manageable, it's not language, that dwelt in his muscles. In order to not be the bad and disgusting boy, he had to regard his enemy as bad and disgusting and meriting violent blows. In the analysis, I'm coming to the end now, the preventive and therapy part. In the analysis with Mr. T, Peter Fonagy had to stand lots of symbolic and vicarious blows and attacks. And he had to stand and answer them analytically. That means by explaining to the patient the function of his violent attacks, maintaining an equilibrium of contact and de-escalation of his own anger impulses. This is a crucial point in the work with violent patients, and it's quite difficult sometimes. Fonagy and Target suggest that, quotation, patients such as Mr. T try to exert total control over the analyst's mind and use it as a vehicle for their own projection, end of quotation. So, the analytic position in this work can be maintained not only by correct interpretations, but also, most importantly, by their timing. If the patient is outrageous, the analyst has to act very quickly in order to prevent himself and the patient from impulsive responses. You know, if you are under fire, normally you react angry. And I know this best. And to refrain myself from reacting angry, I have to think. And if the fire goes on, you have to think quite quickly. That's an interesting situation and experience. So at least the inner work of interpretation has to be done sometimes in the time of a few seconds. If it is not done, even if the analyst refrains from acting out and remains silent or says something not meeting the point, the patient succeeds in taking over the analyst's mind, and at least for this moment the battle is lost. The omnipotent fusion with the analyst's mind, the inhibiting of his ability to think, brings the patient once more into the circle of violence and loss of real contact. Thus, what is really helpful in the online analytic situation is timing. Proto-narrative envelopes, you remember this, are something like a blueprint of categorized interaction and affect patterns, and they are governing emotional all over the lifespan. Together with the Boston Change Process Study Group, Daniel Stern has applied this model also to the psychoanalytic process. And you can describe an analytic session like this, that is beginning with a phase of moving along in which the dialogue unfolds without great effective disclosure. But then all of a sudden something happens. Maybe a topic attracts attention, something happens in the transference, in the affect life. However, a feeling of being together is felt by both participants, which transforms the whole situation into a meaningful, significant event. After such a now moment, as he calls it, there is a time of open space, of thoughtful exploration and just dreaming, and the course of the session redirects to the moving along as before, but on a higher level of understanding. This course of the session can, in example, be compared with the proto-narrative envelope of the breastfeeding experience. It displays a similar sequence of growing intensity, climax, and relaxation. If, as we think, violent behavior is connected with early misfits, leading to an impairment in the mentalizing capacity, so what can we do about it? Can we take any measures to prevent children to fall into the trap of shame and violence? Yes, we can. Since the 70s, this is a postcard of the 70s, since the 70s, psychologists wonder why some children survive obviously bad upbringing conditions without developing any pathology. Emmy Werner found in a famous 40-year prospective longitudinal study in, as you see, Kauai, Hawaii, that despite their poor social environment, 1/3 of the adolescents did not exhibit destructive behavior. Werner called this group resilient and demonstrated specific differences. Protective factors were demonstrated, for example, favorable temperament, school performance, communicative and problem-solving activity, self-confidence, religion, external support by church peer groups, and school. The character of the child, his ability to learn and trust. You know, this is the title of our meeting here, the subtitle. His ability to trust was a high-loading factor on resilience. In the light of infant research, this character development might well be influenced by the early dialogue affect attunement processes described above, including, I underline this, the negative affects. Now, to the concrete field of prevention studies. The Frankfurt Prevention Study, this is the study Marianne Leutzinger would have presented to you if she was here, which in fact she isn't, but I will try to replace her in this point. The Frankfurt Prevention Study is a representative study. This is the participants. So, representative prospective study in 14 kindergartens comparing 1,000 to 2 times 500 children aged 3 to 5. It could show that psychological, non-medical 2-year prevention and intervention program is able to reduce the number of children with psychological disintegration disorders, mainly ADS, significantly prior to school age compared to a control group. The secondary aim to sensitize nurseries for early prevention was also fulfilled. Some findings of this study. I didn't work in this study, so I can only relate what Marianne gave to me, but the findings are interesting. They found that after 2 years of this preventional work, they could lower aggressiveness in the study group compared to the control group. Also anxiety and also hyperactivity, but only in girls. This is interesting in the interpretation. We are waiting for the interpretation of this finding. One part of the prevention program, apart from supervision, parent work in the first year, was the application of the Faustklaus prevention program designed by Manfred Zerpka, translated from the American Second Step Prevention Program, in the second year of the study. So I think Professor Zerpka will explain this program to you himself, because he is here, and I don't have to go into it. It's aiming at the reinforcing of empathy, social competences, emotional competences, and the control of impulsive behavior. And I think I can skip the details now. Just to mention another program is Zeit, designed by Jürgen Körner, in brackets the president of our new university, brackets closed. Jürgen Körner, psychoanalyst in Berlin. And for me it's important, it's also a cognitive program with 40 lessons have been worked down. It's important for his triangular structure and for a fixed time frame. So, you know, my topic is time. And in the Zeit program, it's very important to say we have the fixed frame, like an analytic treatment of these minutes. You have to be here and you have to leave the session at this time. And this is a triangulation point, very helpful for the development of mentalization processes. The last, or nearly last program I will mention is what Karl-Heinz Prisch does in Munich. He's an attachment researcher, and here's a program, Baby Watching in Kindergarten. It works that mothers with their babies come into a kindergarten, in their nursery group, once a week for 1 year, and they just play and interact with the baby as they are used to at home, and the nursery kids watch it. They experience this situation. Trained nursery teachers talk to the kindergarten kids about their experience, and what didn't write it on the slide. What they found out is that these kids are really in grade to transfer their experiences with the baby into their playing and into their interactions. So just to be part and testimony of such a good and healthy interaction between mother and baby helps the elder children to internalize these mentalizing strategies, just empathy, and to understand what is going on inside of another person and to verbalize it. So I am at the end. I haven't looked at the watch, but I hope I'm in time. But just to give you an impression of a prevention program which is not a scientific and not a therapeutic, but a very interesting program. I'm referring to the film, to the movie Rhythm Is It. It was a very interesting project done by the choreographist Royston Muldoon and supported by the director Sir Simon Rattle and the Berlin Philharmonics. And they took 250 Berlin street children, disadvantaged children, and they brought them to dance. It was a dance training, I think for 1 year or something. They danced the Sacre du Printemps. And what I want to show you now is the last minute of this Sacre du Printemps result, what they came, because Rhythm Is It, please the film. I think this project was so successful because it answered the rhythmic necessities of adolescent people. You felt a bit of this tension and resolution curve maybe in this short example. So, I surpassed my paper. As I expect the most important factor of efficiency of prevention and therapy of violence to be the quality of the relation. Temporal experiences are tightly intertwined with this quality. Important steps of research have been done and are continued in the field of the study of temporal relatedness. As you have heard, I am going to teach at the International Psychoanalytic University. What we need are bright young students and researchers to work with us on scientific, psychoanalytic, and interdisciplinary understanding of human mental life. So, research and further understanding of the temporal aspects of infant development, adolescent prevention, and therapy might be one of the main fields of this interdisciplinary enterprise. So if you are interested to join us, be it as a future student of clinical psychology, be it as a research fellow, you are welcome to join us. Thank you.